Have you ever thought about what intelligence is? Not about who's smart or who isn't, but what intelligence fundamentally is at its core. Is it raw processing power, memory capacity, or perhaps the ability to solve complex problems? We usually define it as some sort of combination of those things. Then we design tests around those criteria and call the results intelligence. Intelligence becomes a score, something you either have or you don't. But what if that's the wrong way to think about it? What if your brain is less of a supercomputer and more like a key? Unimpressive in isolation, but incredible because of its ability to access something far larger than itself. It's a strange thought, and perhaps it doesn't make much sense. But hold on to the idea, because it might actually be true.
This is an orangutan. We all know them, and we all know that they're incredibly intelligent. But they're still not building cities, writing equations, or asking silly questions on the internet.
And yet, this animal might just hold the key to some of humanity's biggest questions. Not just what intelligence is, but how it evolves as well. Let me show you. Currently, there's 3 different species of orangutans on the planet.
The Sumatran, the Tapanuli, and the Bornean orangutan. The Sumatran and Tapanuli reside on Sumatra, while the Bornean orangutan lives on Borneo.
These species all look remarkably similar, but it's not just appearance. Genetically speaking, they're almost identical as well. In fact, they're so closely related that they can even produce fertile hybrids. Now, there's a good explanation for this similarity. See, Borneo and Sumatra have only been separated for about 1 million years, which in evolutionary terms is the blink of an eye. But even though they all are almost identical, there's something weird going on.
See, modern genetic methods allow scientists to identify which genes natural selection is acting on in different populations.
In other words, it's possible to see which direction evolution is pushing different species. And when a group of scientists looked at exactly that for the Bornean and the Sumatran orangutans, something strange showed up.
For the Bornean species, the genes under positive selection were mostly associated with lipid metabolism, muscle function, and cardiac activity, which means that evolution is pushing these animals towards efficiency and energy preservation.
Which, for reasons you'll soon understand, was pretty much what was expected. The unexpected part was that on Sumatra, the results were completely different.
Here, evolution is favoring genes associated with brain development, neural wiring, and learning. In other words, evolution seems to be making these orangutans smarter.
This is 2 species that are only separated by 1 million years and a few hundred kilometers, slowly being pushed in completely opposite directions. So just what is going on here? Why would intelligence be advantageous in a rainforest on Sumatra, but not in one on Borneo? To answer that question, we need to go on quite the journey. Because this isn't just a story about Borneo, Sumatra, or even the orangutan. It's a story about how intelligence even evolves in the first place. And for the orangutan, that story began 30 million years ago in northern Egypt.
During this time, the world was a very different place. For millions of years, the planet had been warm and humid, with dense rainforests covering most of its surface. But around 30 million years ago, that started to change. Ice began forming on the poles, which gradually stripped the air of its moisture. This caused a global drop in both humidity and temperature, allowing seasonal forests and open grasslands to slowly fragment the dense tropical forests that had dominated for millions of years.
But in Egypt, things were slow. Its low elevation and rich river system turned the area into an oasis, a pocket where species adapted to the dense tropical forest could continue to live like they had done for millions of years.
One of the species that did exactly that was the small arboreal primate known as Adaptations saucus.
Now, this little guy was one of the first monkeys to ever walk our planet. It belonged to an early diverging branch of the lineage that would eventually give rise to apes and old world monkeys, which is just every monkey species outside of South America.
It walked on all 4s and climbed carefully on top of the branches. Its teeth had the same molar pattern that we see in orangutans and other apes today, broad and rounded, built for crushing and grinding fruits. Unfortunately for Adaptations, the Egyptian refugia didn't last forever. Over the coming millions of years, the ice cap steadily kept growing, locking away more and more of the planet's water, causing the global drying and cooling to accelerate. Eventually, those last pockets of dense forest began to fragment into patchier mosaics of woodland and open terrain as well.
Which meant that even in Egypt, food, especially fruits, became more seasonal and less predictable. And this forced the lineage to adapt.
Somewhere between 25 and 30 million years ago, the lineage split into two separate evolutionary paths. The Old World monkeys adapted by evolving sharper, rigid molars that made it easier to process tough, but more available foods like leaves, seeds, and unripe fruits.
The apes, on the other hand, doubled down on fruits.
They retained their fruit-crushing molars and developed longer limbs and more flexible joints, allowing them to eventually hang below the branches and reach far for their essential food source.
Interestingly, this lifestyle also meant that they no longer relied on their tail for balance. So eventually they just lost it altogether. Or at least that's what we think happened. Today, that trait still defines every living ape.
Around 19 million years ago, shifting tectonic plates connected Africa to Eurasia for the first time in 60 million years. Now, species could suddenly move freely between the two continents.
For the apes, this may have been a narrow escape. See, the climate changes in Africa were not slowing down. On the contrary, the tropical forest was slowly but surely being pushed back by seasonal forest and grasslands. Fruits steadily became more and more unpredictable.
But in Eurasia, it was a different story. Vast subtropical forests covered most of the continent, fruits everywhere.
As soon as the apes reached these vast and abundant forests, they exploded in diversity.
Species such as Dryopithecus, Gryphopithecus, and Pliopithecus could be found scattered across the continent.
But from here, we are actually not sure what happened.
We know that somewhere between 20 and 17 million years ago, the ape lineage split. Lesser apes diverged from the great apes. But we don't know whether that happened in Africa or Eurasia.
And it's the same story for the great apes. We know that the lineage split somewhere between 17 and 14 million years ago, but we don't know where. Some evidence points to Eurasia, while other data favors Africa. Whether the origin was Eurasian or African, we obviously know the outcome.
The African apes ultimately ended up in Africa, while the gibbons, and crucially, the great Asian apes, ended up in Asia.
Okay, so we are now in Asia somewhere around 12 million years ago. At this point, the Asian branch of great apes had already diversified into several distinct lineages.
Species such as Sivapithecus from India and Pakistan, and its Southeast Asian relative Corapithecus from Thailand and Myanmar.
And this is the moment where species actually begin to resemble the modern orangutans. For millions of years, these apes were doing great. Warm forests and abundant fruit. But then around 10 to 7 million years ago, the world started to change yet again.
The planet was entering a phase of intense cooling. The vast subtropical forests that had covered most of Eurasia began to fragment and shrink as well. Dense evergreen landscapes gave way to more open, seasonal environments.
Fruit once again became scarce and unpredictable, which caused ape populations to crash. By the late Miocene, almost all of the Eurasian apes had vanished. But in South and Southeast Asia, things unfolded somewhat differently. This region stayed wet and warm enough to sustain rainforest. It created a sort of refugee, just like Egypt had done millions of years ago. But it wasn't perfect.
The uplift of the Tibetan Plateau intensified the monsoon system, concentrating rainfall into shorter, more intense periods. Around the same time, the El Niño Southern Oscillation began influencing weather patterns across the Pacific.
Together, those forces created a new reality. Strong, unpredictable seasons. Months of heavy rain and abundant fruit, followed by long, dry stretches where food became scarce. The rainforests didn't disappear, but they changed. They became seasonal in a way they had never been before. And for the ancestors of the orangutan, this created an existential challenge. Adapt or disappear.
Many species couldn't adapt. Sivapithecus, for example, went extinct at the height of these changes, approximately 7 million years ago.
But the orangutan lineage found a way, and that way is exactly what turned them into the animals they are today.
With no other choice, they started eating new types of food. Things such as bark, unripe fruit, seeds, and leaves. Over time, their teeth adapted, developing thicker enamel on the molars to handle these tough, fallback foods. Today, the Bornean orangutans actually have the thickest tooth enamel of any living primate for exactly this reason.
But surviving on such a low-calorie diet requires that energy is spent efficiently. So they had to slow down significantly. And that is why orangutans always seem so lazy.
Everything they do is slow and deliberate, calculated to waste as few calories as possible. Even their metabolism has adapted. Today, they have the lowest weight-specific metabolism of all the great apes. And whenever food becomes scarce, they double down on this. They move even less, rest even more, and cut their daily energy use to nearly 1/3 of what they burn during fruiting season.
But here's the thing. For most animals, this lifestyle wouldn't even be an option. See, there's a reason why most animals evolved to move fast. Predators. But it just so happens that a big arboreal mammal in a Southeast Asian rainforest doesn't really have any natural predators. The biggest predator in these jungles would be the tiger, but tigers don't climb trees. There's the occasional leopard, but generally an orangutan is just too big for a leopard to handle. So because they were exactly that, big arboreal mammals, they could adapt the way they did. But the lack of predators did more than that. Because when you don't have to worry about being eaten all the time, then you don't really have to worry about much at all. Besides finding food, of course. As a result, species that evolved without any major predatory pressures generally become less aggressive and will often ignore other animals nearby. They simply aren't used to treating everything around them as a potential threat. In short, they became tolerable animals. But tolerance alone doesn't mean that they are social animals. In fact, orangutans live almost entirely alone.
It is thought that the ancestral form of orangutans lived in groups with a single dominant male, sort of like present-day gorillas. But as food grew scarce, individuals had to disperse farther and farther in search of food. Staying together meant competing for the same limited resources.
The simple solution was to split up. So that's exactly what they did. Today, orangutans live a life of semi-solitude, meaning they only interact whenever there's an abundance of fruit or when raising their young. All of these adaptations allowed them to survive in this new unpredictable reality. In many ways, these traits are what made the orangutan. But that's not the real takeaway here. The real takeaway is that these traits in combination created something extremely unique: a long childhood. Surviving in a Southeast Asian rainforest is not easy, even if your body is optimized for it. There's no predators, but there's still plenty of plants that can and will kill you. Navigating this environment requires knowledge. Way more knowledge than any infant orangutan can ever gain on its own. This creates circumstances where it's beneficial for infants to stay with their mothers and learn how to navigate the complex environment.
This, combined with the fact that their energy input is extremely limited, means that natural selection favors slow growth in infants. If they grew too fast, they would simply starve to death before they ever got the chance to reproduce on their own. Plus, the mothers simply cannot produce offspring more frequently. Creating an entire child requires a massive amount of energy, which they just don't have.
Because of these circumstances, orangutans have evolved one of the longest childhoods in the entire animal kingdom.
Newborn orangutans are dependent on their mothers for up to 10 years. In turn, around 94% of infants survive till their own first reproduction. For context, humans only achieved that level of survivability within the last century.
Now, just as with the slow lifestyle, this was only possible because there were no predators. If predators were eating the young orangutans before they could reproduce themselves, then natural selection would counteract this and select for faster development.
Over the course of a few million years, this lineage of apes adapted to survive in this new unpredictable reality. Thicker teeth, slower metabolisms, and crucially, greater tolerance, solitary lifestyles, and long childhoods.
Together, these three adaptations form a foundation that would eventually push some of these animals in a completely new direction. But to actually make use of that foundation, they still needed the final piece of the puzzle. And to find that piece, we need to get back to the map. Because around 2.6 million years ago, the planet entered a new chapter.
The climate began swinging between ice ages and warm interglacial periods, which made sea levels rise and fall by over 100 meters each time. And this had a dramatic effect on Southeast Asia. when sea levels dropped, the islands of Sumatra, Borneo and Java were no longer islands at all. Instead, they were part of a single landmass called Sunderland. But when the climate warmed again, the seas returned, cutting these forests into isolated islands once more. At this point in time, ancestral orangutans had successfully spread across much of Southeast Asia. Genetic evidence suggests they first entered Sunderland through Sumatra via the land bridges that formed during low sea levels. From there, they colonized Borneo, Java, and even spread as far north as southern China.
So for most of this time period, orangutans were actually doing good. They had managed to spread across most of Southeast Asia, surviving ice ages and rising sea levels. But about 50,000 years ago, the inevitable decline slowly began. Scientists are not sure exactly what caused this, but there are two main ideas. The first points to the massive environmental shifts that came with the last glacial cycles. It's a story we know by now, but basically cooling and drying meant rainforests gave way to more open woodlands, savannas and seasonal forests. For the orangutans, that meant survival was only possible in the scattered pockets of rainforest that remained. The second idea blames something else entirely. Us. Well, not us exactly, but our species.
By 70,000 years ago, modern humans had reached the mainland of Southeast Asia, and over the coming millennials, they would spread further, eventually reaching Sumatra, Borneo and Java. As they spread, they hunted large mammals and used fire to clear forests. And for a species that had adapted to a life without predators, this was devastating. The slow life cycle of the orangutan means that even minimal hunting pressure can be catastrophic. Consistently removing just 2 or 3% of a population per year is enough to eventually drive it to extinction, no matter how large the population starts.
Whatever the cause, orangutans had vanished from most of their former range by about 2,000 years ago. Only 2 refugees and 3 species remained.
The Tapanuli and Sumatran orangutan on Sumatra, and the Bornean orangutan on Borneo. And with that, the map starts to look familiar again. Which finally brings us back to the question we started with. Why would evolution favor intelligence in one rainforest, but not the other?
Because now all that's left is to understand what makes these 2 islands so fundamentally different. Let's start with Borneo.
Borneo sits on some of the oldest, most heavily weathered rock in all of Southeast Asia. After millions of years of rain, most of the nutrients have simply been washed away. What remains is thin, acidic soils that contain very little nutrients. Because of its geographical position, the monsoon system and El Niño events hit Borneo especially hard, swinging it between long wet and dry periods. Many trees here only fruit once every 5 to 10 years. When the forest finally does fruit, everything does so at once. Brief and overwhelming. But when it's over, the forest can go quiet for months, offering almost nothing to eat. Sumatra, on the other hand, is almost the geological opposite. It sits directly on the boundary between 2 tectonic plates, which means regular volcanic activity.
And while that might sound catastrophic, volcanoes are actually incredibly generous.
They bring nutrients from deep underground back to the surface, continuously refreshing the soil. Because of this, Sumatra's soils are young, rich and productive. Its location means that the monsoon system and El Niño events does not cause seasonality to the same degree as on Borneo. The forests here are dense and productive, with fruits being available most of the year. Long periods of scarcity are rare.
Now, based on that information, you might assume that abundance in itself makes evolution favor intelligence. And I mean, the logic is kind of there. More food means more energy, and more energy means more fuel to power bigger brains. But it's not that simple. As a matter of fact, it's actually almost the opposite. If there's food everywhere, then it doesn't actually matter how smart you are. Even the less fortunate individuals will get enough food to pass on their genes. So evolution doesn't reward intelligence in that scenario. To make evolution favor intelligence, something has to make being smart actually worth it. So what does? Let's go back to Borneo for a second.
When food is scarce, orangutans spend most of their day just trying to find it. Traveling, conserving energy, and living mostly alone to avoid competition. Every second is about survival. But on Sumatra, the rules change. Here, the orangutans don't have to wander as far. Less forest can support more individuals, which means territories start to overlap. And where territories overlap, individuals start to encounter each other. They start watching, interacting, and sharing space in a way that simply doesn't happen on Borneo.
And suddenly, they aren't spending every waking hour looking for food. There's time left over, time to be social, and crucially, to learn. And that's where evolution starts to care. Because when learning from others become possible, being better at learning suddenly matters. Imagine one orangutan figuring out a clever new way to open a tough fruit.
It's faster, easier, and wastes less energy. Others nearby see it, copy it, and soon the whole group is doing it.
That one small insight gives everyone in the group a better shot at surviving. The orangutans who are best at noticing and learning these tricks end up with an advantage. They survive a little better and thus pass on those same traits, curiosity, memory, and the ability to learn to the next generations.
Generation after generation, those traits compound, creating a positive feedback loop.
Scientists call this loop the cultural intelligence hypothesis, the idea that intelligence and culture evolves together, each pushing the other forward.
Because once knowledge starts to flow between individuals, natural selection doesn't just reward the strongest or the fastest anymore. It starts rewarding the best learners.
And this loop doesn't just create smarter individuals, it creates a smarter species.
A slow and steady accumulation of shared cultural knowledge, slowly but surely being improved by curiosity, observation, and innovation with each new generation.
But in order for this process to actually work, a few specific conditions must be met.
First, you need a long, protected childhood, a period where the brain is still somewhat programmable, where individuals can afford to be bad at something while learning to be good at it.
Without that buffer, the pressure of survival is too high to experiment. You'd be too busy staying alive to ever get smarter. Secondly, you need overlap. For knowledge to become culture, you need a bridge between the generations. The teacher and the student have to coexist long enough for information to transfer.
If a genius orangutan invents a new tool but dies before anyone sees it, then that spark of intelligence vanishes with it.
Finally, you need social tolerance.
You have to be able to stand close enough to the teacher to actually see the details. If a species is too aggressive, no one is allowed to watch.
When all of those things come together, then the ball starts rolling entirely on its own. And that's the incredible part. Intelligence doesn't evolve due to just one selective pressure. It emerges whenever a collection of traits, each evolved for a completely different purpose, just happens to work together. And that's exactly how evolution works. It doesn't plan ahead. It just keeps building on whatever happened to survive.
If that ancient ape hadn't adapted to eating fruit in the trees, it would have never become an arboreal animal. If it hadn't become an arboreal animal, predators would never have allowed it to develop the slow lifestyle that Asia's seasonality demanded. If it hadn't slowed down, it would have never developed long childhoods. And without that childhood, there would be no bridge for knowledge to cross between generations. The final piece of the puzzle was getting to Sumatra, where the environment finally allowed the last piece to fall into place.
Every step was dependent on the one beforehand. And the result is a natural experiment that we didn't design, didn't plan, and didn't even know we were looking at until we started asking the right questions. But if all of this is true, then we shouldn't just be able to see the results in their genes. We should be able to observe real culture visible in wild populations. And we actually do.
Across Sumatra, orangutans are observed using tools, learning from one another, and passing behaviors down across generations.
And these behaviors aren't the same everywhere. They change from valley to valley, population to population.
In the peat swamps of Balambeng, for instance, orangutans have been observed carefully crafting sticks to extract insects and honey from holes in trees. But travel a few hundred kilometers north to Katambe and you'll notice something completely different. The orangutans there use sticks to open termite mounds on the ground, but never to extract insects or honey from trees.
These aren't genetic differences. They're all the exact same species. These are something else. Ideas, traditions, culture. Learned, remembered and transmitted through observation alone.
And what's incredible is that none of this was found on Borneo. Not a single individual on Borneo was recorded manipulating sticks in any way.
But there's actually still more to this. See, in 2016, a team of researchers noticed this pattern and realized that the orangutans were practically the perfect natural experiment to actually test the cultural intelligence hypothesis. Since the Bornean and Sumatran orangutans have only been isolated for about 1 million years, their bodies and brains should still be remarkably similar. Their biggest difference should definitely relate to abundance and sociality. So, if the hypothesis is true, then there should be a clear difference in cognitive abilities between the two species.
The team ran a series of cognitive experiments on 33 orangutans, 14 Bornean and 19 Sumatran. All were born and raised in captivity, living under nearly identical conditions.
That way, any differences they found should be related to the species themselves.
Each orangutan was given a set of physical problem-solving tasks. Puzzles like how to get a treat out of a box, how to manipulate an unfamiliar object, or how to find hidden food.
But it wasn't just about whether they solved the puzzles or not. They also watched how the orangutans approached them, how curious they were, how persistent, how willing to try out new strategies, or how quickly they gave up. What they found was pretty much what they expected. The Sumatran orangutans consistently outperformed their Bornean relatives. They didn't just solve more problems, they explored objects more patiently, tried more variations, and showed a richer exploration style. In other words, they behaved exactly as the cultural intelligence hypothesis predicted. Now, I have to make it very clear that this isn't definitive proof of the hypothesis. It is possible that the orangutan just happens to fit the idea while something else is doing the actual work. To truly prove the hypothesis, we'd need to see the same pattern replicated across many different species. But still, this is the first real empirical evidence that supports the hypothesis. And if we take a step back and apply the idea to ourselves, then it does sound extremely compelling.
Imagine a modern human baby raised completely isolated from other humans. That person wouldn't demonstrate anything close to what we call human intelligence, despite having a brain identical to yours or mine.
Not because the hardware is broken, but because they'd never been connected to the network. Because that's ultimately what culture is. A vast accumulated store of knowledge, skills and solutions that no person could ever discover alone. And intelligence, well, intelligence is the ability to plug into that network, to learn from it, to add to it, and to pass it on. Everything that we usually define intelligence by is just a way of doing that primary purpose: learning, improving, and teaching. Even today, everything we do depends on this deep cultural network.
You didn't invent the language you're using to understand this video. You didn't discover agriculture, science, or computers.
You inherited it. Someone taught you, and someone taught them, and that chain stretches back thousands of years. Today, that process has taken us so far that we've created the most powerful knowledge network.
Every human being on the planet is connected. Every piece of accumulated knowledge is available in seconds. If there's something you want to learn, it has never been more accessible.
And honestly, that is just as fascinating as it is terrifying. Because if all of this is true, then what happens when that network breaks down?
This incredible network is getting diluted at an accelerating rate. Slop and misinformation spreads faster than facts. Algorithms that are tuned for attention rather than accuracy decide what most people see. People are losing trust in the institutions that we should be learning from.
If intelligence truly is the ability to access a network of accumulated knowledge, then the integrity of that network matters. And perhaps that's the real takeaway here. Intelligence isn't just about having the biggest brain or knowing more than your classmate, colleagues, or neighbor. It's about maintaining connections, about preserving the ability to learn from each other, about protecting the knowledge we pass down. And if our distant relatives from the jungles of Southeast Asia can teach us all of that, then who knows what other insights are still hiding out there, just waiting for someone to ask the right questions.